With me here today, Bob Greifeld of NASDAQ, the
My
CEO
pleasure to
of
be here.
NASDAQ. So just before we get started, I just want to do a quick intro on Bob. He started in his early career actually as a software entrepreneur before taking up his post in 2003 at NASDAQ. And at the time, the company was reeling from the dot-com bust. And so fast forward more than a dozen years, and NASDAQ has transformed from a single equity exchange to a multifaceted technology and services company. Just a few days ago, NASDAQ announced a complete redesign of its technology architecture. So Bob, I imagine it's been quite a long journey for you from day one.
It sure has.
Yeah. So what has it been like for you to manage and turn around a company that needed such a huge change?
Well, let me say this. When I first came to NASDAQ in 2003, they had perfected the art of the mainframe era in that they had highly reliable systems. It was tandem-based mainframes. The hardware would literally never go down. And the software was carefully architected and engineered, and they would come out with a new release essentially once a year. What happened was the SEC changed the rules, and competition was springing up. And this competition had, somewhat reliable or somewhat unreliable Unix or Linux boxes written in C, and they would turn the code over literally every week. And to the extent they had a production problem, the customers didn't care. They would come back to NASDAQ and to other places. So really, you were faced with the dilemma of how do you maintain engineering discipline in a hyper-competitive world? So I had to bring the organization, forward, and we had to go forward in a rapid fashion. And it's very hard for somebody who's raised in that carefully engineered environment to be comfortable putting out a new release on a weekly basis. And there's no way that a new release can be engineered, can be tested the same way that something that comes out once a year can be. So that was, symbolic of the cultural change we had to make. We had to make ourselves nimbler, we had to be quicker and respond to competition.
Mm-hmm. So as a tech guy, what attracted you to a financial company?
Well, first off, when I came to NASDAQ, I knew that its beating heart had to be a technology company. So that was, I think, somewhat revolutionary in the time. But as you mentioned, I came from a software background, and I was more of a software guy than an exchange person. But I saw that if you took away the imprimatur of the regulatory license, it is a technology company, primarily a transaction processing technology company. We happen to get paid per share or per contract, but at the beating heart, it was a transaction processing company. And to put it in the parlance and the words of the times, we really are a SaaS-based, cloud-based company that happens to have an exchange license wrapped around it.
Mm-hmm. So can you tell us a little bit more about this huge revamp that NASDAQ has just announced with this technology portfolio?
Yes. So we put out our multi-year product plan, and it's important to recognize at its beating heart is a recognition that on the post-trade environment, blockchain technology will change everything. But it's also important to recognize, as fundamental as blockchain is, it by itself is just a tool. And if I try to simplify it, blockchain represents the proper evolution of the database. I was around from the flat files to the ISAM, to the relational database. Now we have essentially a communal database that has a ledger as its reference point. And so it has the ability to change everything, but you have to put a lot of applied knowledge, a lot of IP around that, and that's what we're going to do with this new architecture.
Mm-hmm. So where do you see fintech going in the future? I mean, there's been the collapse of Lending Club. A lot of things have happened in this space. Where do you see this going?
Well, I think we're on the verge of a golden era of financial technology. So just going back to the blockchain for a second. So essentially, by the communal nature of the blockchain, it allows the world to get back to a bilateral environment. And so if you look and understand financial services infrastructure, and this can apply to many industries, you have a lot of the infrastructure tied to the fact that you don't know your counterparty. And so the infrastructure allows me to know that I can trust the counterparty even though I don't know them. Blockchain allows me through technology to get away from that middleman layer and deal directly with each other in a bilateral but trusted manner. We also see that machine intelligence is really at the cusp of changing a lot that happens in the world today. So clearly robo-advising is something that gets a lot of publicity. In our world that we deal in today, the low-hanging fruit is we have a product called Smarts, which does post-trade surveillance, and we do it for brokers, exchanges, and regulators around the planet. So that will see patterns in the data and alert people if something's going wrong or something might be amiss with that. And through the years, we've built up this tremendous pattern recognition through massive amounts of big data. But what you'll see in the next 18 months is the patterns themselves will become intelligent, right? And they will be able to recognize and learn from what they did in the past. And you're going to see that kind of intelligence ripple through many aspects of financial technology. So, when you think about what we did in the last 5 or 10 years in the exchange space, we were about speed. And we introduced, I remember when our matching engines got below the millisecond. Now we're down to 20 or 30 microseconds. We put hardware accelerators in, and that was useful, but only so much, somewhat intellectually interesting. You're going to see in the next 5 to 10 years intellectually interesting things happening across a range of technology, and it's an exciting time to be in the space.
Absolutely. I just want to bring the conversation back towards sort of your management philosophy. How does M&A, mergers and acquisitions, how has this played into your overall strategy for growing NASDAQ?
Well, we've made about 50 acquisitions over the last decade or so. So it's something we do on a routine basis. And we've done actually 5 in the last 6 months, so we're active there. And we have to recognize, though, that we want to have a balanced portfolio of activities. So in our business, we have a very high free cash flow yield. It's fundamentally my job to decide how we allocate that capital. And I want it to be balanced. So we balance it in terms of direct returns to our investors between dividend increases. We've doubled our dividend in the last 2 years, and also share buybacks. So that's the investor side of it in the short or the immediate term. Then we look at what can we do with organic growth? How do we deploy the capital there? And we have some exciting organic growth opportunities. NASDAQ Private Market gets a lot of the publicity, but also our upstart exchanges to compete with the established players in both commodities and interest rate futures. And then we also look to allocate capital to acquisitions. I make sure with acquisitions we go into it with great fear, in that anytime you do an acquisition, you have to realize the risk of failure is real. And I define the increase in risk based upon doing an acquisition that is basically in a different business than you're in. Geography matters. How far they are from the home office matters. The size of the acquisition matters, and the culture of the company. So if you do that checklist, a lot of times we have good acquisitions we'd like to do, but we just turn it down because we think the risk profile is too high. So you've got to look at everything in a balanced way, and we're proud of what we've done there. I would say also that with acquisitions, I like to stay close to the knitting to decrease the risk profile. And when I want to have it, what I'll call a moonshot or something truly aspirational, I'd much rather do that with our own internally generated funds. So we have a bowling alley strategy with acquisitions. We try to stay right down the lane or one pin left or right. If we're trying to do something brand new, I'm more comfortable just doing de novo. So when you look at the upstart markets or NPM, we're investing tens of millions of dollars in that, but it's not hundreds of million dollars or billions of dollars, which you have to do with an acquisition. So we do lots of acquisitions, but we're quite nervous about it when we do it.
So what are you looking at next? What
that I can't
attracts
tell you.
your eye?
Well, as a public company, you're keenly aware of the rules of disclosure that you have, and this might actually qualify as Reg FD because I think we're being streamlined. But even that being said, I'm not going to tell you. But I would say that we always look to lever off of things that we do. So we have made a big bet on Nasdaq Private Market. We had one competitor called Second Market. We acquired that. We had the leading market share in U.S. equity options. We acquired ISE from the Deutsche Börse for $1.1 billion, and that leads to what we're doing. So again, incremental changes in what we do. But it's also important to recognize that even though every step is incremental, if you look over a long period of time, you've walked a 1,000-mile journey in that we started as a single equity market in the U.S., and now we run 20-something markets around the planet and 10 clearinghouses. So even though it's a step at a time, you can advance a long way.
So far this year, what's your general view of the IPO market, and where do you see it going for the rest of 2016?
Well, so far this has been fun, but now you make it less fun. So I would
That's my job.
I hear you. So I would say this: in the U.S., the IPO market in the first quarter was quite moribund. And I think it's fairly easy to predict. So if you look at the end of 14 going to 2015, a lot of IPOs priced had reasonable good days, but in the quarters to come, they sunk below their IPO price. That has a chilling effect in the time to come. So we lived through that in the first quarter of 16. We had 10 IPOs in the first quarter of 16, so it wasn't horrific, but it wasn't good. And a lot of that is based upon the fact that companies that did not have demonstrated profitability in the first quarter of 16 had very limited ability to have their story heard. And that was a direct result of the prior story companies in 2014 and 15 not delivering.
Now, there are a lot of...
on the positive side, the second quarter has been stronger than first. To interrupt you for a second, sorry. And I think third quarter will be stronger yet.
We've got a lot of entrepreneurs here with us at this conference, of course. What advice do you have to them for companies who may be thinking about going public? What do you need to know to do that today, and when would you say is a good time to consider such an option?
That's a great question, and one we talk and think about. And you might be surprised, as the operator of a large public market, we believe a lot of times waiting is better. I think it's very important to recognize that as a public company, you face an endless series of quarters. And I run a public company, and it seems like my report card comes due all the time. So every 3 months, your report card is out there. So to the extent that your business model is not mature to withstand that level of scrutiny, you should think about it. Because the public markets will tend to overreact on the positive and overreact on the negative. And that's something you have to consider. So the other main factor is the communication with the investors has to be very direct. I love to use the biotechnology story. So biotech has been the star of the IPO market for the last 3 years. We mapped the genome about a decade ago. The immunotherapy drugs are truly phenomenal, what it'll mean for all of us. And it's important to recognize when a biotech company comes public, they're really coming public on the hope that their drug will pass through the FDA or equivalent testing. The investors know that, and they're not looking at the given quarter, right? So the investment thesis matches the business model. When the investment thesis of your investors doesn't match the business model, that's when you're going to have dislocations in terms of what the pricing of your stock should be. So if you're going public on the thought that you're going to have rapid growth, the story of rapid growth, you don't do that, you're going to have trouble. If you go public on the fact that you're going to have steady income over quarter after quarter, maybe not great growth, but steady returns, and you don't do that, then you have a problem. And you have to understand the difference between being public and private. And when you're private, the investors know you, and they know more about the story, and you have direct contact. You go public, you create that wall, and they can just, at the end of the day, judge your enterprise on how you have delivered on what you've said directly to them in the past.
Bob, I know you, in business school, you wrote your thesis actually on the operation of the NASDAQ stock
Yes, I
market.
did.
Years before you walked through those doors as CEO.
That's weird, right?
It is weird. It's like
Yeah.
you knew, right, in
Yeah.
advance. How has the NASDAQ of then changed, and how does that compare to the NASDAQ of today?
Well, that's a good question. Let me give you a simple answer. I would say when NASDAQ was formed back in 1971, it showed great vision because it was the first market that was electronic, didn't have a trading floor. And so I would state that what we do today is better. But it's still within the same construct, right? We never had a trading floor, still we don't do it. And right now, every single stock market on the planet has basically copied the NASDAQ lead there. So I would say more our customers around us have changed and the other exchanges have changed. But the vision that created NASDAQ was remarkably prescient.
Mm-hmm. And just one last thing. With this technology portfolio that NASDAQ has leveraged, how do you anticipate this might push forward financial technology overall, and what does this give companies listing with NASDAQ that it doesn't already have?
Well, I would say this. Well, I came to NASDAQ. I had been the CEO of a private company for a decade. And now I'm in a public company context. And I said, boy, it is so much harder to be a public company CEO than a private company CEO. And so our job as a technology vendor to public companies is to provide product and services that makes it easier to be a public company. And what we say to our listed companies, we'll do a great show for you in Times Square when you come public, and that's a lot of fun. But when the party's over, that's where we have the real relationship. When you have that endless series of quarters and you need the product and services that allow you to talk to your investors, to solicit new investors, to communicate with them, to communicate with your independent directors, that's where the NASDAQ value proposition really shines. And that's fundamentally why we're doing so well in the listing game.
Excellent. Well, Bob, I think we'll just have to leave it there for today.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate your time. Thank you.